Hi, everybody. I am Matthew McQuilla, and I am back again with Professor Larry Cotter-Backer to discuss Chapter 17 of his book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. Today, we will be discussing the five demands, legitimacy of force, and the constitution of the two-system principles. This was written on Wednesday, September 25th, 2019. How are you doing, Professor Backer?
Oh, very well, very well. Looking forward to this conversation.
So can you explain to our audience the importance of this chapter? Because I think that this is central to what has happened prior and what is going to happen next. I'm not calling it a bridge, but I think that it does tie the book together on what we should foresee in the future and what we have seen.
All right. Well, actually, I should now leave it to you because you've done a better job of explaining it, I think, than I could. But yes, it is a bridge. And for me as well, is probably one of the most, certainly a central chapter in the book. And it puts a bunch of things together. We've spent most of the action, the discursive action that we've seen from the 9th of June until now the end of September, more or less. We've been focusing on discourse, talky narrative. And we know that while on the one hand you can make fun of it, on the other hand, it's central to influencing the outcome of events, pushing forward legitimacy and the like. But what we've seen since the 9th of June, for the most part, was a lot of discursive movement and narrative control on the part of key public actors. But the central actor in this whole drama, the protesters, have been absent for the most part. Why? And we've talked about this a little bit in prior conversations, was that their discourse was radically different than that of the central authorities or of the G7 or of the United States or of the Brits or of the United Nations. Theirs was a performative discourse in the sense that their discourse was evidenced by their bodies on the street, their disruption of the economy by sitting at the airport, their surrounding of the Legco building, their interaction with the police and the discourse of violence and legitimacy, who is being more violent, who provoked, who is lawful, who is not. All of it was physical, it was just performance. And here, finally, what we have is, I think, with the five demands of, and of course, all of this, not because there was I don't think any of this was conscious, but effectively because when you're dealing with the protest, we keep using the singular, but it really is the plural. There were all kinds of people who were out performing for all kinds of reasons, all of them united in a sense by what they didn't like, read very broadly, but not necessarily coordinated in either a Leninist or an institutional kind of framework. This is a mass movement, but mass here in the plural rather than in the singular. Now, all of a sudden, finally, we begin to see the crystallization of this mass, plural mass, into a singular set of focus in the form of these five demands, which go from, and in a sense, if you look at the demands from number 1 to number 5, you go from the situation on the 9th of June to the situation at the end of September. They become increasingly more radical or more ambitious, right? And they were full withdrawal of the extradition bill, which was a trigger. The second is the commission inquiry into alleged police brutality. This one becomes much more sensitive and meant to crystallize that issue of legitimacy and violence that we've been talking about, certainly since, I guess, the 12th of June, the 11th or 12th of June. Then the retraction of the classification of the protesters as rioters, again, an issue of legitimacy. And this one was particularly interesting because it would effectively undo the core discourse of the central authorities, and then amnesty for the arrested protesters, that's also a big one. And then the last one is dual universal sovereignty, meaning for both the legislative council and the chief executive, which is now we've upped the ante to not to anything surprising, but to constitutional level discourse. So all of a sudden we now see this, and we see its potential discursive power in the sense of what the vision for Hong Kong going forward in the future looks like to that constellation of protesters that have been out on the streets since the 9th of June.
I'm sure it took an incredible amount of audacity to bring about these demands to the central government, I guess from the central government's perspective. But were there any penalties levied, or any potential penalties that they said could be levied against the central government had their demands not been made, or if their demands were not made?
Well, I mean, and again, yes and no, but not in the 5 demands. They're underlying the 5 demands, of course, is the threat. If you fail to meet the 5 demands, we will not go away, which means that instead of working towards the core central authorities principles of stability and therefore prosperity, stability and prosperity, you're going to have the opposite, the withholding of stability and the holding hostage of prosperity, because the mechanisms in place in Hong Kong at the time, this is again according to the protesters, right, make a legitimate stability and a long-lasting and stable prosperity impossible, because of the failure to align the governing mechanisms of Hong Kong with the sensibilities of Hong Kong people as articulated through international instruments which were meant to protect and guarantee the integrity of that system, right? All of which now, you say this to the ears of the local and central authorities, this is, wow. But from their perspective, there it is, and that would be it. And again, remember, we're now sitting in 2021. We are living through. We're not done the pandemic. It's September of 2019. The possibility of this not actually coming to fruition it's not on anyone's mind.
Okay.
Right. And in a sense, there's a dare here too.
Yeah.
Right. And the dare here is, well, here's our demands. They start from the classically reasonable and small to the, ooh, let's talk fundamental constitution and fundamental constitutional protection. The threat is we'll remain on the street. And then the base threat is go ahead, bring the army in from the Pearl River Delta, go ahead, militarize the Hong Kong police and suppress us. Are you willing, this is a protester speaking again, are you, and the protester speaking to the local and central authorities, are you willing to pay the price that this, cornering you into this response will produce? And underneath all of that, of course, is a fundamental threat. And that is June 1989, which was the incident outside Tiananmen. And so here, when you talk about, and it's an excellent question, because none of this is in the 5 demands, right? None of this is in the 5 demands, but all of it is implied in what comes next, right? Okay. And that's what makes this just really, really interesting, because it brings, now finally, we see the crystallization of a much more ambitious discursive project we see that it is backed by mass movement on the streets. And we see that having done that, you have effectively cornered the state, the central authorities and the local authorities, to a series of probably unpalatable choices, even though discursively they have built up a strong, and some might argue equally strong, discursive case supporting their view of the illegitimacy of the actions of the protesters. But now all of a sudden you have something that is looking more like parody, discursive parody, than you had before.
Okay. So what was the response from Ms. Carrie Lam?
Well, you can imagine what the response was. With respect to number one, the withdrawal of the extradition bill, the local authorities said, oh, well, goodness, we did that months ago. The protesters, of course, counter to that would be, well, yeah, you kind of did it, but the day after tomorrow, you can bring it back. We want something, we don't want it to be like Sleeping Beauty sitting in a glass coffin somewhere in eternal sleep. We want this not just dead, but forgotten. And there, the local authorities would probably say no. So, so with respect to number one, well, yeah, we've done this. The protesters would say, no, you haven't done it enough. With respect to number two, the commission of inquiry, the answer was substantially no. Although that was a little fudgy, at least at the beginning. With respect to number three, and of course, the reason it was fudgy is that the local authorities would have wanted to take the position that, yeah, we can look at the response of the police. We've taken the position that the police were fully and legally vested with the authority to respond with the full force of the state, primarily because of the provocations and violence of the protesters. So if we're going to have a commission of inquiry, actually what we should be doing is having a commission of inquiry about the lawlessness of the mass protests, right? And so that's not going to work. With respect to number three, retracting the classification of the protesters as rioters, again, there didn't seem to be much of an appetite for that. Amnesty, even less of an appetite for amnesty, because that would have been an affirming action, right? The minute you give them amnesty, what you might well be doing in the eyes of the civil and local, of the central and local authorities, is to give people permission to do this again, and therefore build this kind of assertion of civil and political rights in ways that they would find absolutely inimical to the core sensibilities of Chinese Marxist Leninism. And then number five would have been impossible. Effectively using the mass protests, the mass demonstrations as a way of engaging in the sort of constitutional discourse that the Chinese had now taken the very firm and probably non-negotiable position that if that's going to happen anywhere, it's going to happen in Beijing. It's certainly not going to happen in the international arena, and it is absolutely certainly not going to happen on the streets of Hong Kong. And so given all of that, the response of the central authorities and the local authorities was at this point, well, thank you very much. No, well, not even thank you very much, but no.
That doesn't appear to be the response that they would have wanted to see. So where does this now leave those who had put this together and organized? And I know we've talked about the potential for a threat if they did not receive the answer that they wanted, but once they got that no, where does this leave them? Well,
it gives them far more presence, discursive presence with other potential actors. Who are the other potential actors? We've already seen them. Yeah, we talked about them in our last chapter, right? Remember that while the Chinese position is that this is an entirely domestic matter, The position of the international community is no, it is not. And while everyone agrees that, and everyone continues to recognize, even through all of this, China's absolute territorial sovereignty over the space of Hong Kong, the international community, to varying degrees, had already taken the position that the territorial sovereignty of China was, by the agreement of the Chinese authorities themselves, constrained by international agreements with respect to the political, economic, and social system that was to be reserved for Hong Kong. And in that context, right, China shared authority with, that's one version, or was accountable to or responsible for, to, in other versions, the international community, for making sure that these agreements and constraints would be adhered to. The Chinese, of course, absolutely rejected that position. The international community increasingly embraced the internationalist position. And now we have here finally a document, a discursive tool, an additional discursive tool, other than a bunch of bodies on the street, around which the international position could coalesce, right? A series of what looks like fairly reasonable positions from the perspective of the West for dialogue and negotiation, pause, under the auspices and subject to the constraints of the international agreement and those sensibilities in the handover, the receding of Hong Kong to China.
You know, for me, I thought it was analogous to two football teams playing against each other and one playing without a coach. And now it seemed that they had a coach and had some semblance of guidance. So I feel like this puts them in a better position. And I would think that, you know, moving forward, it would be a positive, so that at the end, no matter what happened, no matter the outcome, they would be in a better position in the end than they are today, because they are moving in the right direction. Now, that still remains to be seen in this book, and so I'm not going to give too much away. But
well, no, and you make an excellent point. You make an excellent point. The problem, in a sense, given the discursive nature of narrative in the global and the post-global, is that it is based on artifacts. I'm using a jargony term here, but by artifacts, I mean words or writing, narratives, right, are stories. If you don't have if the stories are not appropriately vesseled, if they aren't put in ways in which people are used to relating to or hearing stories, then you don't have those stories. And here, the story that the narrative that the Hong Kong protesters were effectively focusing on was visceral. It's bodies on the street, it comes and goes, and the only records are records that non-protesters, that third parties might or might not take pictures of, including, for example, my picture of the initial protest that is your background, right? But they're not in control. The central authorities and the international communities were very adept at creating stories in appropriately legitimating ways. Discussions, writings, pronouncements, those kinds of things that then preserve the narrative that you can constantly go back to, read, invest with meaning, and then use as a tool. The protests had their bodies until here. Now you finally have an artifact, an artifact around which everyone can coalesce, and an artifact that can then be used as a tool in their interactions with other potential, not just with their adversaries, but with potential allies as well. So yes.
What were you saying?
No, I said, so yes, I mean, your point is really well taken.
Well, I think that those are all the questions that I have for this chapter, unless you have another point that you believe that has been left out.
Oh no, just read the chapter for more detail.
I'm glad we're back with the self-promoting. We've got to do that, you know? The biggest supporter is going to be yourself, but I'm also hoping the reader or the listeners of this will be the next biggest supporters. So yes, everyone follow what he said and go out and buy the book. Again, thank you for talking to me about the book and allowing me to interview you. And we will see you all later.
All right, and I'm looking forward to the discussion of the next chapters. It's going to get really interesting.
Yes, it will.
All right.
We'll talk to you later.